Okay, so Clinton. Um, from my perspective, Bill Clinton is one of the more problematic characters in this whole story of the corruption of the American Republic. And for me, it is that personal ambition that makes him so problematic. So I'm going to start with my favorite story about. This is lying. I have two favorite stories about Bill Clinton. My first favorite story about Bill Clinton, and it was when he was governor of Arkansas during the Reagan administration. The PBS NewsHour was doing a story on one of Reagan's policies. I don't remember what the specific policy happened to be. And because they're actually professional journalists working at PBS, they set it up so that um, first the Reagan administration official presented the rationale for this policy proposal. And then Bill Clinton had been selected to criticize it. So you had one side and the other side, professional journalists. You approach objectivity by having balance. So one on each side. Reagan administration official on one side, Clinton on the other. Okay? Because you're professional journalists. Because they're PBS, they invite an academic in to then be interviewed as well. So here's what happened. The Reagan administration official does his explanation, defense of the policy. Uh, Bill Clinton, who's nobody's fool, just absolutely takes it apart. They're in remote locations. They go back to the studio, PBS NewsHour. The anchor is talking to the academic, and the academic leads off with, I think Governor Clinton really nailed this criticism of this policy, and he's absolutely right. Clinton didn't realize that they'd switched the camera back to him. And he, yeah, just big demonstration of victory. Okay. Normal people don't do that, right? I mean, it's you would be restrained at that point, but it got across um, that level of personal ambition. He was already looking beyond being governor of lousy little Arkansas, okay? And this was a great moment for him in terms of getting exposure and getting validation from this academic. Um, I I think Clinton really does have some core values and beliefs, um, but he was remarkably flexible in what he was willing to do, and that's a large part of what I'm going to go over um, tonight. That's relevant for the organic constitution. The framers expected that elites were going to do their very best to figure out what they thought was best for the country and do it in a disinterested way. Um, Not be driven by personal ambition and not to flop around in terms of positions they were holding. Um, in a in a more mundane kind of way, you get that demonstrated with campaign ads. One of the most effective types of campaign ads is the weather vane ad, where they will have a candidate flip-flopping their position and the weather vane will be whipping around. Okay? It's not what the framers expected elites to be doing, and even ordinary citizens are going to have problems with that. Um, I skipped over George H.W. Bush, and I mentioned the reasons in the previous session, but I had to delete that um, section, so I'm gonna put it in here so it's at least available to folks who missed it. Um, The elder Bush, who's preceding Clinton, the elder Bush was not a Reagan conservative. And he referred to the supply side tax program as voodoo economics. Uh, Reagan only had him on the ticket to have some kind of ideological balance, and also uh, Bush certainly had more gravitas than Reagan did, so it provided an advantage there. But the problem is Reagan conservatives never really warmed to George H.W. Bush. They never trusted him. Uh, they ended up just savaging him when, after he did the read my lips, no new taxes, and then had to raise taxes for very good reasons, but nonetheless, that's not what was on their program. They just savaged him. He gets a bump in popularity with the Iraq War. Iraq had invaded Kuwait. This is okay. And that really led a number of high quality Democratic potential challengers to George H.W. Bush to decide to not run. Any intelligent candidate will judge whether it's a good time or not such a good time to be running. They're not always the most intelligent in terms of making those determinations. Any political scientist could have told these clowns that rally around the flag phenomenon, where Bush's approval ratings went sky high, were only going to last a brief period of time, which did not extend up to the election. So you weeded out a whole bunch of really potentially wonderful Democratic challengers, not Bill Clinton. And then Bill Clinton gets the additional present of it's a mild recession, but it's still a recession in the wake of the Iraq War, and that then gives Clinton, hands him the presidency. Okay, and the next part actually has local flavor. Clinton became part of a group that's called the Democratic Leadership Council. And the local flavor is the guy who founded the Democratic Leadership Council. His name is Al Fromm, F-R-O-M, from South Bend. This is a group that attempted to steer the Democratic Party away from not just the progressive policies of the 60s and 70s, but even casting some doubt on the New Deal. They were much more conservative than the Democratic Party had been. And they had one of those, the proof is in the pudding kinds of things, like when was the last Democratic president? After LBJ, you had Carter, and then that was it. And Carter is conservative from the South. So it lent credence to these folks who wanted to move the Democratic Party to the right. In a larger sense, one of the things that I want lots of folks to know is that they were pretty successful. There's a group that developed a way of scoring ideology on the part of members of Congress that took into account changes in the issues. So you could compare ideology scores of representatives and senators across space and across time. Okay? They then developed a way to apply it to presidents. Here's your I guess this is fill in the blank question. Post World War II, who was the most liberal Democratic president?
It's a good question.
That's not an answer.
I
I feel like
mean,
I feel like he's trying to trick us.
like a trap.
I'm
I
not,
mean,
why, what do you mean trick you? I just laid out the question. What do you, I actually
it's
kind of gave you a hint. If it was straightforward,
complicated. I mean, it
well,
is
that's
complicated.
not complicated. It's counterintuitive, particularly given the way that idiots talk about ideology today. When you call Biden a socialist, like what the hell?
Well,
I
that's
mean,
ridiculous.
that's sort of where I want you to.
Well, that's ridiculous. We do
I
But
know it's
but
ridiculous.
you're asking who was the most
Liberal
liberal of the
that.
presidents.
Democrats,
I mean,
or
FDR.
of all the presidents, or the Democratic presidents?
Well,
Well,
that's the same question.
FDR. I'll say FDR. No, no, I didn't. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I just was like, that's why I was tricking. I was like, is there a Republican that was actually more
I
liberal
mean, FDR put in
than
place a lot of the social safety net programs, but like LBJ put
LBJ?
in place like civil rights.
See, I mean, a lot of people would probably pick LBJ, but it's not LBJ.
Okay.
You saying Carter?
No, no,
But who else have we got here?
Harry Truman,
Dang.
the one Democratic president who I know this is a single issue, but the one Democratic president that really, really pushed national health insurance. There are lots of other issues, but nobody pushed socialized health care as much as Harry Truman did. Nobody thinks of Harry Truman as this wild-eyed liberal. Well, part of the reason is that the DLC was pretty successful in moving the Democratic Party to the right. And Bill Clinton was a big standard bearer um, for the DLC. Um, I don't I don't have data on Biden, but I don't think Biden even gets up to gets up to Truman. Um, the way that you really want to think about the DLC and Bill Clinton is that they wanted to stand up and support the interests of the white middle class. There's
Hmm.
nothing progressive about that. Um, it it looks a little more liberal than Reagan, which was the white supporting the white
Upper class.
upper class. Nonetheless, it's not it's not supporting. Well, I'm gonna get to some of those policies in a minute. Um, so that's on the one hand, but where I want to go, and again, I'm really indebted to you guys for the discussions we've had about trust in government. That's where I want to go. Trust in government at the beginning of Clinton's term, it takes a bit of a dive, but then it increases steadily through the end of his presidency. It's not getting to sky
Yeah.
high levels, but it's improving in other words,
Do,
Clinton managed somehow to build trust in government after some initial missteps. Yeah, Laura.
do you think that that coincides with the fact that the economy was doing so well?
Well, we'll get to
Okay.
it.
When everybody's pocketbook feels better and their jobs feel secure, does that there's relative peace, it's before 9/11. But the war, the Iraq war, although it's, we still have troops there, but it's not as much as what was happening with
Yeah,
Senior Bush.
yeah,
All of these things would contribute to people maybe feeling more confident in our government.
yeah.
And
And that's sort of the next thing that I want to do.
okay.
So in the same way that we we handled Reagan, let's take a look at the performance of the Clinton administration. Well, we did that with Reagan. Let's do it with Clinton. And what you have with and we'll do the same kind of thing. Let's look at our early on budget, what the budget looks like. Um, his omnibus budget reconciliation act of 1993 did play a key role, and this did reverse that supply side approach. It raised taxes on the top 1.2% of taxpayers and cut taxes on lower income taxpayers as well as small businesses. And to Laura's point, it supply side economists really should have lost all legitimacy. The economy didn't tank. In fact, it did exactly what Laura described. The economy grew steadily throughout the course of his term. Not only that, I think it was the last 3 years they ran budget surpluses. After all the
I mean,
yeah, go
that's
ahead.
when I graduated from college. So I remember coming out and being like, look at all these jobs I can get,
Yeah,
where so many people get out of college and don't have that feeling. And that's how we all felt when we were coming out. It's like, oh, look, there's just all this stuff I can do.
yeah,
That's why I remember it, I think, so keenly.
yeah.
Oh, I was gonna. Well, I graduated in '08, so I didn't have that experience of all the jobs. But you had the .com boom, and they teach in econ because I took so many econ classes, especially with the .com boom, because there was all the technology. You move out the curve, and that's why the economy was doing so well.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So, to Laura's point, certainly the character of the economy looks like you ought to be able to take some credit. That ought to contribute to that rising trust in government. Here's one disturbing thing, however. I described that, you raise taxes on the top 1.2%, you cut taxes on lower income individuals, inequality is unchanged. You haven't made a dent in inequality by doing that. Okay? And that's one of those puzzles we want to get to here, because it's not as though there's plenty of work done by political scientists that matters of equality really don't redound to the incumbent administration's benefit. It's not as though if you reduce inequality, people start supporting you more, and so it's not inconsistent with that. So things are booming, but poor people are still poor, and wealthy people are still really wealthy. Okay. If you look at substantive domestic policies, they're a real mixed bag. You get on the more progressive side, you get the Family and Medical Leave Act, something that enjoys pretty bipartisan kind of support. The embarrassing failure to get healthcare reform through with Hillary running the effort. But at least there was an effort. You get rare gun control legislation because that's from the Brady Bill. mandating background checks come through. And finally, you get an initiative to really deal with the AIDS crisis. You've waited that long, but finally you get an administration that's going to do something significant about it. But you also get the Defense of Marriage Act, legislating that marriage is between a man and a woman. You also get Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Right? And my favorite, the Omnibus Crime Bill of 1994. This isn't the beginning of mass incarceration, but it's mass incarceration on steroids.
Is that the 3 strikes and you're out? Is that part of that, or was that already happening?
There's a whole bunch in that.
Yeah.
It's applying the death penalty to offenses that didn't involve murder of any kind. They're like drug trafficking offenses
Yeah.
that carry the death penalty. So again, I'm not screwing around with sharing screen anymore, but I want you to take a look at this, and I'm going to try to point this out here. So if I can get it here, this is Reagan starting it. This is Clinton. The Clinton administration is responsible.
And that's like low-level drug offenses where people are going to prison for life and that kind of stuff is happening there. Right? I mean, is that?
Yeah, it's part of it.
I mean, it's more than that, of course, but yeah.
Yeah. So the prison system growth by the end of Clinton's administration, it's about 1.3 million. When he came in, it was under 800,000. And just the slope of that line, you could tell, right?
Almost doubles in 8 years. Wow.
Yeah. And here's where I get to my guilt knows no bounds. There's one of my students who did a senior thesis on inequality and looked at a number of things, looked at tax cuts, and she also, as it's called the dummy variable, put in mass incarceration. Mass incarceration was more important than some of the tax cuts in increasing inequality. So if you want a possible answer for why you could do these things with the tax rates and still not address inequality, the reason is you're throwing poor people in jail at extraordinary rates, okay? And then for entertainment, do any of you remember Tipper Gore? You have to go back and get on YouTube and watch some of her rants about obscenity, indecency in their music. And she was part of the group that was responsible for getting those parental advisory stickers slapped on CDs, slapped on albums. And for Clinton, nobody's going to remember this artist, but during the 1992 campaign, Jesse Jackson had run in 1988 for the nomination, okay? He's still around. Jesse Jackson probably comparable levels of ambition to Bill Clinton. He still wanted to be a player. He wanted to be central to this. And the DLC and Bill Clinton wanted to make it clear he's not one of our people. we don't agree with Jesse Jackson about this cultural stuff. So Bill Clinton takes aim at Sister Souljah, who I believe had a very limited shelf life, doesn't have an enduring artistic record, but it was a really nauseating sort of cultural beatdown that he wanted to offer. Again, I have problems with misogyny and violence in rap music, but this was pretty calculated. Okay, it's not really that he's got a genuine distaste for this. You have Toni Morrison proclaiming Bill Clinton to be the first black president, right? And then he does this. Tony, wise up. You know, it's not, you're not the first black president because you can play saxophone, because you're comfortable with African Americans if you're doing this, if you're taking pot shots at a cultural, at an art form that is so closely identified with the African American community. Okay, the foreign policy stuff, you really get a sense that I don't know that anybody would be in their depth, but he was really out of his depth in deciding where and when to commit troops. And you have a couple of incidents of possible genocide where he doesn't go to Rwanda, he doesn't commit troops in Rwanda, he does in Bosnia-Herzegovina. None of those really got him any support, and certainly he took a lot of criticism. And to his credit, he acknowledged that failing to commit troops he really regretted failing to commit troops to Rwanda. I saved the final domestic policy that's my favorite for the end, to get at the damage that Clinton did to the organic constitution. So this is my second favorite story about Bill Clinton. It really should be my very favorite because it involves my younger daughter's first political memory. This was the 1996 Democratic Convention. Clinton was on, they called it the Whistle Stop Tour. So they were stopping at the station in Michigan City and then going into Chicago where the convention was being held. A friend of mine who is the mayor's administrative assistant got me a couple of tickets. So this is my younger daughter Caitlin's first political event. I took her to that, held her on my shoulders for the entire, she was just a little pup. So I held her on my shoulders the whole time. And it was absolutely vintage Bill Clinton. So for starters, he's 2 hours late because he was always late. I'm gonna probably say this unnecessarily, but you understand that the entire crowd was loyal Democrats. Republicans aren't showing up. These are really hardcore loyal Democrats, and they're there at Michigan City at the station. Clinton had just signed welfare reform legislation. That legislation set up what was then called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, TANF, TANF. That was replacing the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or Aid to Dependent Children, AFDC. And the title of the bill is going to tell you an awful lot about this. This was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Get it? Virtually everything in this bill looks like it could have come from a Republican president. There are work requirements. It ended up reducing welfare workloads and benefits. And I'm going to make the point. I think I've mentioned this study before by Kay Lehman Schlossman and Sidney Verba called Injury to Insult. It's the only study that actually interviewed welfare recipients and found that even before you started treating them as badly as this piece of legislation did, as Reagan did and this piece of legislation did, the embarrassment and the sense of personal guilt that it's my fault I couldn't get a job leads a significant number of legitimate welfare recipients to not even apply for aid. Okay? That's not the key part of the story. Here's the deal. He mentions that when he's talking to the crowd and gets overwhelmingly loud boos in response. Heavily Democratic crowd. Nobody there likes what happened in that bill.
So, Pat, so his political appointee at HHS, Health and Human Services, who was there when that happened, who was in the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, resigned. I was in the department at the time. Resigned as a result of that legislation. I mean, this was a very liberal, but on principle, just resigned as a result of the, it was.
Yeah.
And
No.
by the way, I think was the beginning of the end for that program. So that program now is like,
Yeah.
there's so little support for cash assistance, safety net program. And that was the beginning of the end. So
Yeah.
just to underline what you're saying.
Yeah. So here's the sort of punchline, although it takes a little bit. Big boo. Bill Clinton's a smart guy. He's rhetorically really smooth and clever. He started spinning out an explanation that this was just the first step. We're just getting started and we're going to change it and we're going to get around to doing. It took him about 2 or 3 minutes. The crowd cheered him. They cheered him. They had booed him 2 to 3 minutes earlier. He was able to wrap him around his finger, so they were cheering at the end. Okay? Most people, when they're looking at things like that, are going to say, "Wow, he's amazing. Who could do that? Like that? That's an incredible skill." I'm using it for exactly the opposite reason. I'm worrying about someone who can manipulate the public in the way that he did, and it wasn't just the public. I mean, when we get to Newt Gingrich, like Newt, even though Newt talks about how much he loves Bill Clinton. Okay. What I want to focus on for now is that says something about Bill Clinton and the way that elites ought to behave from the framers' perspective, to support the organic constitution. Does that make sense, y'all? Um, and we're getting to presidencies where a bunch of you have. I mean, Anne's recollection is invaluable. If you remember what it was like at that time, what's your recollection of Clinton in that sort of communicator role of the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, we called him Slick Willie, right?
Yeah, it was
I mean,
that started out with an Arkansas journalist, but yeah, I called him Slick Willie in class. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, and sort of, I'll get to your question, but the people felt betrayed, for the substance of the policy. But I think it's also true that, I mean, at the time, you sort of talked about it, I think, more as he did connect with people, and in that sense, he was a
yeah,
good communicator. I think it was a little bit for me more in retrospect. I mean, he left. Now, again, you had the tech boom and all kinds of things going on. He left the country with what, a $1 trillion, surplus. I mean, there were certainly, but, when you look back, I mean, I think you're right. I think he was one of the cogs in the wheel of the changing political climate that's leading to the corruption of the republic. Like, I think, you know, even if like at the time you supported him, I mean, he was slick. He was a talker. He manipulated, and I think I kind of see his part in the story, and he carried on what Reagan started, which is government is the problem. I feel like he didn't really dissuade people from that. I felt like it was he was sort of kind of tap dancing a little bit, moderating a little bit, but it was similar because at the same time, you remember, he cut the bureaucracy heavily. Reinventing government was all about
yep,
promoting efficiency and effectiveness, and a lot of it. And later, there's an academic named Paul Light. I don't know if you've read him or not, but he wrote about
yeah,
about this. They cut all these government workers to, quote, save money, but in the end, they fired off. I mean, they didn't fire people like they're firing them now in the Trump administration, but they
sure, yeah,
yeah. Anyway, but people left through recidivism. They didn't refill positions. But what happened was they just hired a bunch of contractors, so it ended up costing the government more money.
yep,
Which is kind of, I think, eventually what's going to happen with the Trumpies. But anyway,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
so there were a lot of things that he did that didn't necessarily build trust in government, but got him like political points for being, I mean, nobody objects to efficiency and effectiveness, right? But he didn't really do that. Not really.
It's interesting because obviously, Anne, it sounds like you were working when he was in office. You were already out of school. Obviously, Pat was my professor, so he was working, and
Yeah,
I
I'm
was
old
in
now.
school. But I was in school. I mean, Clinton is the first president I ever voted for, right? So his second term was the first time I was able to vote. I went to that Michigan City rally. Well, I don't think I was.
Really?
I don't know, but it was outside. Wasn't it outside, or he
Yeah.
did a stop outside? Yeah, you gave us extra credit points. I went with Kelly. I went with Kelly, and I went. You said anybody who could make it there, and we could prove it. And I can't remember what we brought back
Oh,
as
that's
proof.
right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
I was there.
Wow.
But I was too young and naive to really understand all of this stuff, which is what's fascinating now as I'm older and more in the workforce. Then, exactly what Pat is saying, we just saw this charismatic guy who could talk to the people, and he made the crowd excited. Like, he made it exciting to be a part of this. As you know, a young adult just getting into this sort of world and getting
Yeah.
interested in politics in general, Clinton really holds a really like, kind of special place in my heart for that.
Well, and
All aside from all the other
right,
things, but
right.
but I
And
agree. But I think it is his sort of politicianness of it, you know, like his slickness, his ability to spin that at a rally and to spin his words is
yep.
what made him so effective, even though, you know, as a full-fledged adult in the workforce, you might have seen the backside of that.
Yeah, and I'll go right to the point that you were making, Laura, and that is he really was more focused on he wanted young people to get more involved in public service. That was a big deal for Bill Clinton. Um, and so when he was communicating, he was he worked great, right? I mean, that was your reaction was I want to get involved
Yeah.
in this, and he he pursued some public service programs as president, but that's sort of in one direction. It's not going back out to citizens doing what citizens need, and it's instead, I want young people to become um,
But
more involved in public life, almost like in a servant role, not really the sort of participatory as he is. So it's really marking that off. Yeah, Ann?
Pat, I think the other point about the Clinton administration is I think it was also I think the idea of sort of the corporate influence on politics also was ramping up at that time, because if you think about the tech industry was ramping up, and with NAFTA, like I actually did not vote for Bill Clinton the second term. I did a protest vote to good old Ross Perot, open up the hood and look at, but because I was so annoyed about NAFTA. But I'm thinking back,
Yeah.
like the corporate, that was a little bit of the start of that corporate influence, which I think drove the establishment of NAFTA. And it bore, I think my judgment bore out, because they made all these promises about how, oh yeah, we're going to open up the borders, and then workers are going to be treated, they're going to be paid more, and they're going to be and none of that happened, right? It was just more exploitation of the workers, and that was Clinton.
Yeah.
That was Clinton. And I understand the rest of the world was going in that direction, but that was Clinton. So when you talk about the corruption of the public and you talk about the role of money and corporations, I think that's another marker to look
Yeah, and
at.
it certainly was opening. I mean, corporations certainly had a great deal of impact with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush.
They did.
But it's
He opened up the store.
yeah, for the essentially saying this is going to be a bipartisan thing now. We can all get behind NAFTA.
We can all get behind the corporations,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to fill it out, I'm glad you brought up NAFTA, Ann. Just to fill it out, one of the reasonable criticisms of NAFTA was that there really wasn't much at all done in terms of the environment, which is one of the things that should have been done in trade agreements. If you're going to sort of erase these trade barriers, then do something to deal, well, one, with workers' rights in the home country and with the environment, and no, which meant that handed all the power to the corporations that were engaged in international trade.
I always felt like Clinton, it was a missed opportunity to really, and he did, there are some things he did, I think, that were good, but it was a missed opportunity
Well, I mean,
to move forward a more progressive agenda to deal with some inequalities, to right some wrongs. And I feel like it was a missed, because he was very, that just wasn't what his interest was.
Well, if maybe not everybody knows this, he served one term as governor of Arkansas and then got defeated. That was a key learning experience for Bill Clinton, and it was part of his desire to adapt and do whatever he needed to do to stay in office. And the difference is he's smart. He's smart. He is able to relate comfortably. He has social skills. That rhetorical skill, all those things together mean he can do it really, really well. Other folks may want to do it. He's going to get it done because he has that intelligence. He has that rhetorical skill. He has those personal qualities that make him convincing. But that exhibition in Michigan City was stunning. It was just absolutely stunning. You don't. I could feel the sentiment in the crowd, kind of moving in that direction, but I was viscerally appalled while watching it happen. But and that's how this is a double-edged thing. And I did start out with the number of policies. Family Medical Leave Act. I mean, that was
Yeah,
huge. That
big deal.
initial budget, that was huge.
He balanced the budget and we had a surplus. It was huge. That was a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, yeah. It's just that you didn't need to be doing that sort of triangulation and
You know,
then
you know what it is? He didn't.
engaging in the demagoguery that
Yeah.
he did with Sister Soldier, um, and with mass incarceration. Yeah,
And
that wasn't necessary.
he didn't use his, like, if you think of like an FDR, like, he didn't use his communication skills to lead people in a direction,
Yeah,
which is a sign of a really strong leader. It's not about just meeting people where they are
yeah,
and then getting them to, like you said,
yeah,
cheer for you when they were, but like leading them to see a different future that benefits everybody. And that was the missed opportunity, because Clinton had the communication skills to do that. And I think he was just too much part of the establishment. And I
I
don't
think
know all the reasons
that
why.
that's why I went back to the lost election in Arkansas. Is
but they
that
did credit him for being the explainer in chief, right? He was good
Yep.
at explaining complex issues. I think he's very talented. My memories were similar to what Laura was talking about. I graduated from St. Mary's in May of 1988. He won just months later. And I remember just being thrilled that a Democrat had finally won the presidency. And he knew how to talk to people, and you were very much sucked in, I guess, at that point, is what I'm saying. Is I remember being very excited that we finally had a Democrat, and he, even credited him for like crossing the aisle to work on things together. So like in the beginning, and maybe it wasn't really till many years later where I could look back and, criticize some of the things, but at the time, I just remember being elated, just being elated with, that he was smart and charismatic and could talk to the average person. Those were the things that I think helped him immensely in that 1988. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. and it's where Anne was going with it that I sort of wanted to go. Um, it's where you take folks. So that was part of the organic constitution, is that you want to take folks so that um, they support the government, they trust the government, that they're more public spirited, that they're directed to the good of the whole, as much as possible. And the framers certainly understood that there were limits on how far you could take ordinary citizens. That they had they had a far better sense of the limits of ordinary citizens than scholars of voting behavior had for years. Um, Again, it's why I had folks early on do that agenda setting survey where you had phone interviews with ordinary citizens. You cannot, until you have that experience, you cannot understand how lacking in political knowledge and information ordinary citizens are. So there are limits on what you can do, but it ought to be done for that purpose, not just to keep yourself in office. And certainly not the manipulation of their emotions, which is what he was doing with Sister Souljah, which is what he was doing with welfare reform, with mass incarceration. All those were not as demagogic as Trump, but still there's some manipulation of people's emotions, making people afraid of fellow citizens of color. That's not something that is supposed to be part of the organic constitution. That's not what elites should be doing. And it was just on its face. It was baldly a sort of cynical attempt to make sure that he could position himself so he could win. I think Anne actually said it better than I did.
It's just interesting to hear their perspective. Again, sort of people in the different levels of their lives and careers and the different perspectives. I also wonder if, I don't know, talking about this in a historical context, we have a little bit of revisionist history in that we know more now, right? We are all more aware of what these programs have done to our society. We are all more aware of how we speak about other races and other genders and other minority groups now than we did even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly 20 plus years ago, 20, 30 years ago. And so I do think that although we can look back on it and say, this wasn't great, were we really at that time? Now, I'm not saying people didn't think it was good or thought it was good or not good, but were we really looking at it in the lens of what we knew and how society felt at the time 30 years ago that we do now? Am I making sense?
I would absolutely agree. Like,
yeah.
There's different levels of analysis, right? So at the time you think and there's within the context of that time in history, how people reacted based on what they knew in their reality. And then there's like where we are now. And I think there are two different sets of analysis, but I think now we have a little bit of a bigger picture of, I think Pat, I don't think this is where you were going. How did this contribute or not to where we are now? And I think what I heard, and I think Bill Clinton was an amazing communicator. And I think, in many ways that served him well and served the country well. But, and I don't know, I mean, was it unique, Pat, like that he was able to manipulate and turn. I mean, I'm not, I would ask the question, like, I mean, FDR, he certainly turned how people thought about things, but he was also like, he was a leader in that he was pushing people to a different place. I don't know that that's particularly new, but yet in the narrative,
Yeah,
right?
I think, FDR is a special case because he has, I'm being ironic when I say this, he has the benefit of the Great Depression and World War II. So, you have, if you're president when there are disasters not of your own making, it provides unique opportunities for leadership. He certainly grasped those and used them. Um, Reagan was particularly good at doing that. Um, there wasn't any particular crisis that was going on. He created the crisis of the counterculture and those things. But he was just Clinton could do that kind of emotional manipulation with his intelligence. Reagan certainly wasn't using his intelligence to do it. It was just his folksy manner, the sort of, aw shucks, I'm just like you folks, I'm going to use this isn't even out loud, but I'm going to use the language that ordinary schmucks use. Um, and he was really very, very good at it. You have somebody like George H.W. Bush, not good at all, not good at all at that.
I
And
guess, Pat, are
and
you
and
going, like, the way to think about it is you had Reagan. Was it that Clinton there was a missed opportunity? Like, Reagan laid the framework for distrust in government. Government is the problem. Perhaps in retrospect, it just occurred to me, Clinton would have had this opportunity to help rebuild and sort of refocus people around the value of government, but he didn't really do that.
well, that's sort of the point that I'm making about he was big on ordinary citizens engaging in public service. That was the way that he addressed it, but it's not necessarily what needed to be done.
But not policy, which he could have.
And not,
And like the
you
welfare
know,
reform is an example of where he didn't. He didn't advance the ball.
yeah, yeah. And I suppose a really, really sympathetic reading would be get folks involved in public service, and then in turn, they're going to have more faith in government and more trust in government. But that's not really. I'm not going to be cynical about that one. I think that's who he was. I think that was one of those core values. He really believed in ordinary citizens should get out there and do the public good. But it's not necessarily what you needed in response to Reagan saying government's the problem.
Yeah.
You could still see government as the problem, right? But you want ordinary citizens to get involved in public service. That's a
Hmm.
you can do those two things. And so it didn't undo the kind of damage that Ronald Reagan did to how people saw the government. But and this may be the way to end. Um,
It didn't stop the march toward corruption.
no, no. But where I'm going, where I'm going,
Sorry, I had to be a little
where
dramatic
I'm
there.
really going, where I'm really going is, but trust in government did go up. So I love leaving folks with dramatic suspense. So I think that's where, and that's what we'll get to um, in a later episode. I'm not going to give it away. In a later episode, we'll get to that. But it does leave you, particularly with what Ann and I were saying. We're saying all that stuff, but on the other hand, trust in government went up. So how do we unravel that? That's coming up.
That's your teaser, Pat.
Pat,
What-
can
what's
I just
ours?
make can I just make a comment about his like charisma? So I saw him as a sixth grader um in January of 98. So like right after the scandal hit, he he and Al Gore went to the University of Illinois, which is where I'm from, and he and Gore were both so electric and so, I mean, I remember it just being like such an exciting place to be and to listen to them and just how much energy they had and how they were so like invested in the youth and just wanted to make
Yeah.
things better and education and like University of Illinois is where a lot of the internet started and things like
Yeah.
that. So there was so much praise for that. But I just remember, and I think it's considered one of his like comeback moments, that he was like there was this huge scandal going on, but he just acted like nothing was going on and just
Yeah.
we were like the only, I mean, it was just such an amazing memory. And so I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what Laura and I experienced in Michigan
Yeah.
City. Was there was real positive energy in the crowd. And you wouldn't see that so much at either of the Bushes rallies. You'd see it at Reagan's,
Yeah.
um, and then you're going to see it at Obama's. But then you get to Trump and it turns negative. It's not the positive energy. It's really negative energy. But yeah, I would imagine that it was, and again, you guys could speak to it more than I could. I think it probably was inspiring for lots of young people.
Yeah.
All right. This was our 45th wedding anniversary.
Oh, happy anniversary.
Well, thanks.
Tell Eileen thanks.
Can you want to clarify that expression of gratitude?
No.
It's actually tomorrow, but she's busy tomorrow night, so we went out to dinner tonight. So, alrighty. It was good seeing you guys. I will get this taken care of before I leave for Berlin and Sweden, and I'll be in touch when I manage to get things lined up to do another episode. All right.
Have a
great-
great trip.
Thanks.
Yes.
Take
Thanks
care,
so much.
guys. It's good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.